Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel after what feels like forever. I actually don't know how long it seems in terms of your subscription feed, but for me at least it's been a few weeks since I filmed and I have just had one illness after another. I'm not going to go into it because it's just a long winding story of like one illness causes another illness causes an illness, the antibiotics cause a new illness, blah 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 blah. So I have not sat down to film for what feels like forever and what has in reality only been a few weeks, but I thought a nice way to ease back into it would be to do a classic top 10 list of book recommendations. And specifically today, rather than looking at a genre or a format or a theme, we're looking at books that I feel are underrated. So I'm sure a lot of you are like me in that when you discover a new book either online or in a bookshop and you haven't seen one of like your favourite book talkers or bookstagrammers review it or talk about it yet, so don't know much else about it other than the blurb sounds interesting, you might look up reviews. I typically get my Goodreads app out and I'm checking what like the average rating is and then what people I trust say about it, and particularly if it's not got a super high average rating, what people like and dislike about it, so I can figure out whether those are things that I might like or dislike about it. Because oftentimes I would have missed out on some amazing books, some 4 or 5 star reads for me, some new favourites if I'd just gone by the average rating. And this is what this video is themed around. But, and this is different for everybody, there are certain ratings I think, oh, that's a little bit lower. And then I have to remind myself that, like I mentioned already, I've often found some of my favourite books have average lower ratings, and this could be for a variety of reasons. It might be because they're very divisive, so you get a lot of people going for one extreme or the other. It might be that the book has been somewhat mismarketed, which does happen. So people have gone into it with certain expectations and the book has not delivered, and that can certainly be disappointing. Or it might just be super weird, and sometimes weird doesn't get the highest average rating, but if you're like me, you might like really weird if it's done well. So I just thought I would sit down today and talk to you about my favourite 10 books that I feel personally are underrated. Perhaps I haven't found their audience, perhaps aren't for everybody, but I am sure there are a large number of you who will really enjoy them just like I did. So I'm not going to go into detail about what their average rating is because I don't think it really matters. I'm just going to tell you about why I love them, and perhaps you might love them too. So without further ado, let's crack on, shall we? Now the first book on this list is The Magusties by Tiffany Tsao, and I do actually want to mention one of the reasons I think this might have a lower average rating. It's not something I'm going to do for every single book on this list because I think it would get tedious, but I think this book is incredibly mismarketed. When I picked this book up, one of the things it mentioned on the cover, one of the things it mentioned on online book descriptions was that it was like Crazy Rich Asians. And it is absolutely nothing like Crazy Rich Asians other than the fact that it features very, very rich Southeast Asian characters, which, you know, is a massive issue in itself that it was then compared to Crazy Rich Asians on that simple fact, because plot wise and writing style wise it's very, very different. And I think a lot of people who might have gone into expecting another Crazy Rich Asians would naturally be disappointed because it could not be further from that. But I do think it's an excellent, excellent book. It is about 2 sisters from a Chinese-Indonesian family, a very, very wealthy Chinese-Indonesian family. Their entire family is very wealthy, their parents are very wealthy, they've gone on to have very successful careers, at least in one of their cases, in quite like obscure, like high-end industries that I don't think most ordinary people work in, you know, and you just like immediately become the CEO of a company and you've got thousands if not millions of pounds behind you from your parents. But this is the kind of background they come from, and it's about both sisters, but it's from the perspective of one sister in particular, and we're actually following her recalling her past from a coma. So from the very outset of the novel that you know that this sister has been poisoned as part of a mass murder suicide at a family gathering, and it seems as though her sister, her best friend, the person she's been closest to her entire life, poisoned their entire family at this gathering, including her, and she is currently, as it stands, the only survivor, although she is in a coma. So all the information she has learned about this incident has been through overhearing the nurses and doctors talking around her, and she is trying to process this in her comatose state, and doing that through recalling her past and her childhood and her teenage years and her young adulthood and her and her sister's relationship and their experiences. And it's such an interesting book because it is conceptually a mystery, like what happened, why did the sister do this, how did it come about, what moment led to that, or was it a series of little moments, and you want to know what happened and what might still happen. But you also find, as you're just reading this like recollection of the past, that sometimes you forget where it all led, or at least I did. I just got so immersed in the story of these two sisters and their family that I kind of forgot why I was being told their story, or like where it was potentially leading to. And for that reason it almost felt like I was getting like two books in one. I had a mystery and I just had a very interesting story about two very, very wealthy sisters and their experiences, and I really, really enjoyed it. I found it a very compelling read. I think that balance between there is a mystery but it's also just a compelling story set in the past works really well, and I think it keeps you turning the pages, and it's really well written, really, really interesting, really compelling, and full of lots of twists and turns and just like interesting character building. So I really, really enjoyed this book and would highly recommend it if that specifically sounds like your cup of tea. Next up we have Catherine House by Elizabeth Thomas. Now this is a book that most commonly appears on recommendations for like dark academia centered novels, which is of course a very specific subgenre in itself, but I actually think this book like toes the line between dark academia and a kind of surrealist sci-fi story, and I think that's really important to bear in mind, which come together to create a sort of like traditional what's going on mystery horror novel. It's not like gory horror, but it's certainly unsettling, and I think it might throw some people off or not be to some people's taste because of that more like sci-fi surrealist element, which I think is perfectly valid. But if you like the idea of that combination, then this is really worth checking out. In particular, this one gives me massive Stepford Wives vibes. Like it very much feels like it is playing on the themes and the tropes of what is quite a classic horror story at this point with the Stepford Wives. So I think like if you enjoy the Stepford Wives, this would be a really interesting comparative read. And it's about a young woman who gets offered a place at a very, very elite college or university, and it's a little bit unclear why she gets this place, but she has a teacher who thinks she has what it takes, and despite her difficult background, she gets sent off to this very elite institution. And one of the things I think this book does really well is put a lot of questions into your mind and makes you think about the issues around elitism in academia, the prevalence of elitism in academia, which I think in turn is a really important element of dark academia as a genre. Like if your dark academia book doesn't question or try to address elitism in academia, whether it's through racism, sexism, classism, or a combination of all three, then I don't care for it. Like I'm not, like, then personally I don't care for it, I have no interest in it. Like I don't want to read a book that romanticizes and idealizes academia. I want a book that perhaps undermines the romanticization of academia, and I think this book does that. And it's a very weird book, don't get me wrong, and all of your questions are not going to be answered during the narrative, but I don't think that's necessarily important for me as a reader. What was more important was how like tangible the writing was. Like it was very immersive. I felt very drawn into the setting and the time and the characters and the environment that they were all in at this university, and I really enjoyed that. And I just thought it was such a like lush, beautifully written novel that tackles very disturbing themes. And I don't really want to say too much more about the themes other than what I've already said, because I think there's a lot of guesswork involved in this book, and I think there's a lot of surprises in this book, and I don't want to spoil any of that for you because I think it can be quite a roller coaster of a journey. But if you're looking for a dark academia book that draws on the themes of Stepford Wives, that falls into kind of like surrealist horror at the same time and has very beautiful lush prose, then check this one out. On that topic, I'm going to stick on the sort of like dark academia train, maybe just more of like educational academic setting. I wouldn't necessarily call this a dark academia book, but I would call it a modern day gothic, and that is Madam by Phoebe Wynne. So this book is actually set in the 90s, which I'm not sure if at this stage counts it as a historical novel. As someone who's born in the 90s, it's a very odd thought to think that the 90s might be historical, but it's set in the 90s without being written in the 90s, as it only came out in the past couple of years, and it is very much a modern day gothic. Like, this book very intentionally follows the traditional tropes of gothic literature, and I think the thing is, when it comes to gothic literature, is that they are very much tropes of a time in which characters sometimes make very odd decisions and are particularly very naive. The central protagonist, usually a woman of a gothic novel, is usually very naive. And I can completely understand that that might be a little bit strange to read as a modern reader reading a modern book, but I think if you think of it in the light of like traditional gothic literature and kind of like subverting the tropes of gothic and playing with that naivety of our central character in a more modern setting, although still the 90s, then it is such a well crafted book. Like, it's so well done, and it's actually about a teacher. So rather than the new student at the university or the new student at school, we have the new teacher. We have a young classics teacher. Do love me a book that interacts with the classics. I think it's a very good subject to explore elitism through, who is offered a job at an elite all-girls boarding school. So the students here are the daughters of the richest of the rich, and she turns up at the school. Remember, it's the 90s, it's not like the 1800s, only to discover that it has a little bit of a like finishing school vibe about it. There's definitely a lot of ingrained sexism, there's a lot of expectations on the young women at this school to grow up to be wives to the wealthy rather than continue their academic pursuits or get careers, and she's a little bit surprised by this, naturally, as a young woman herself who is very career focused and who loves her job and who has the sensibilities of like 90s feminism around her. And she is trying to teach these girls while also understand the background of the school and what's currently going on at this school in her contemporary time. And while there might be moments where our protagonist is tempted to leave, she doesn't really have that option as somebody who doesn't come from a wealthy background, who really needs this job that pays really well, that funds her mother's care, who's really ill in her old age. And in that sense, she's kind of trapped here. So we have our naive gothic protagonist trapped in this big old stately home that functions as a school and is teaching classics to her students through some of the most like famous historical and mythological women. So there's lots of references to historical and mythological women of antiquity, and I really enjoyed those little like Easter eggs, shall we call them, from like the perspective of someone who loves antiquity. And I think it all comes together beautifully. It really like ticks all of those boxes. It's the perfect modern day gothic, and I really adored it. Now, the next book on my list is actually a short story collection, which I haven't been reading a ton of in the past few years. I went through a massive phase in like 2014, 15, 16 perhaps, where I just could not get enough short story collections, but I haven't been reading as much of them of late. And this is one I read in the past couple of years, and that is American Housewife by Helen Ellis. Funnily enough, I actually bought this collection during the height of my like short story collection phase, but then didn't get around to reading it until like 5 years, 6 years later. But I'm really glad that I did eventually get around to it because I loved this collection. I think I was going to say one of my favourite short story collections I've read in the past few years, but given I've not read many at all in the past few years, that probably doesn't mean much. It's probably one of my favourite short story collections of all time. If I did a new top 10 short story collections, if I did a top 10 short story collections video, it would be on there. So in general, maybe because I've not been reading so many of them lately, I find it hard to summarise a short story collection because it's a bunch of different stories, right? Like, there's many stories in here. But thematically and genre-wise, what can you expect from American Housewives? So this is another one that I actually think would be perfect for fans of Desperate Housewives, although it definitely follows more of like the satirical route than the like horror route. It's a collection of like satirical, slightly bizarre short stories that tackle issues of sexism and misogyny in society, and it is very funny, but not in a like sitcom way, in a kind of like, oh my god, I see the parallels with society, oh the irony, oh I can't believe this, oh clever observation there. Like, it made me laugh in that way, if that makes sense. And it's a very interesting collection because all the stories are very different. Like, it didn't feel like repeat after repeat in terms of characters and plots. Certainly the themes are overlapping, but in terms of like what I came to expect from every story, it was very different. Like, some felt like very 1950s, some felt very contemporary, and all of them say something about society in a very clever, sharp, snappy way that's very entertaining to read whilst also thought-provoking. So all in all, I really enjoyed this collection. I also think Helen Ellis is a phenomenal writer. I haven't read any of her other work, but like, if her prose on average are like the prose of this book, then I think I would very much enjoy to read more. So let's move on to something a little bit more chipper and cheerful than all of these like dark, subversive, feminist horror and satire works, to a romance novel. Not to say that that's any less feminist, but the romance novel I wanted to mention in this video is Rules for an Unmarried Lady by Wilma Counts. So this was my first time reading a book by this author, but it very much cemented that I would like to read more by this writer. And I love when I discover a new historical romance writer because it's one of my favourite subgenres of romance, specifically your old 1800 Regency or Victorian romances, which this falls into. Now, this is a little bit different from a lot of historical romance I've read though, because it's not quite the same level of like high angst drama as some. It's a lot softer and quieter in some respects, and one of the things I think it does beautifully is deal with grief and the aftermath of grief and building a non-traditional family, which I think is really nice. And amidst all of that going on, we have our romance. So what is the plot of this book? So we follow Harriet, whose sister and brother-in-law have recently passed away. They were in an accident which killed them both and left their multiple children orphaned. So she takes on the responsibility as their godmother to move into their home and care for them and be there for them, and although not replace their parents, to like be like an equally important, loving family member who can help them process their own grief and look to the future and feel loved and cared for. And she's been doing this for like a little while at this point when her brother-in-law's brother returns. So this is like a family member through marriage. He is also obviously the uncle of these children, but they're in no way like blood related. He is the brother of her sister's husband and the godfather of these children, and he has now also inherited his brother's home and estate and is in charge of running all of that, as well as taking care of his children, who are now officially like his legal wards. And he comes back with like grand plans of sending them off to school and doing all the like proper things that are meant to be done, and this is like the system, this is how society works, and I'm going to provide for them, but I'm not really going to be there for them emotionally in this hard time. You know, it's been a few weeks or months, they like need to get to school now. Like, I feel like that's the approach, which is probably was a very common approach. And on the other hand, Harriet feels they need more time. They don't want to go to school yet. She wants to respect that. She wants to be there for them. They want like love and family and to remain at home even if their parents aren't there. And they love both their aunt and uncle, and their aunt and uncle both very much love them. They just have different ideas of what is best for them, and together they kind of have to navigate a compromise or figure out where they're willing to like concede to the other in order to give the best life to these children, especially in this time of grief and their own grief. You know, they've lost their sister and their brother, people they were very close to and loved very, very much. So they're all struggling with this loss, and they're all trying to find the new normal, and they're all trying to work it out, even if they've got different ideas of what's right. And then there's also a bit of an interfering mother-in-law, specifically the male protagonist's mother-in-law. So that's all going on, but naturally they find a middle of that they might be falling for each other. And I'll say no more, but it's a romance novel, so you can kind of expect what... So you kind of know what to expect, don't you? You know, you've got your like traditional romance like plot points being hit, and it's a very endearing romance. They make a really lovely couple, and I really enjoyed how the book explored a lot beyond just their romance in terms of like the family dynamics and the grief, and I thought that was really well done. Technically this is a third in a series, but with a lot of romance novel series, it stands alone. It's about its own couple, and the previous two books are about Harriet's friends and their own romances. So in terms of reading order, you can read them however you like. You just won't have met Harriet previously and seen her interactions with her friends before this book, but there's no like really important plot points that you need to know before going into this. I think it works by itself. Now, the next book I want to mention is actually a trilogy, and it's a trilogy of comic book volumes. So it's a completed comic book series called By Night, written by John Allison, so the same writer who conceptualized and created Giant Days, my all-time favorite comic book series, might I claim. Love Giant Days. If you haven't read that one is like very, very widely lauded, but this one doesn't seem to get quite as much praise, and I think that's a shame because it's really, really good series. And perhaps the reason it doesn't get so much praise is because it's quite different from Giant Days. Humor wise it's the same, but in terms of genre and plot it's very different, because this one rather than being simply a contemporary series falls into the like sci-fi fantasy world. I don't know which one better describes it. There's a bit of both, I think, is what I will say. And it's about two old school friends, or two old childhood friends, who are reunited as adults in their 20s, both a little bit lost, both figuring out what the future holds for them and what their path might be, when one of them returns to their hometown. She's been away for school, I believe, and she comes back for a job, and they reconnect, as I mentioned. And during this reconnection they somehow stumble into a portal to another world, a fantasy world, and a like very strange, dangerous, bizarre, satirical fantasy world that is clearly poking fun at a lot of the tropes, or at least drawing on a lot of the tropes of traditional fantasy. The way they get there is very like, and although it's very much fantasy world, the way they get there is very much science fiction, in terms of there is a weird machine that creates portals and was the result of an experiment by a scientist back in the day that perhaps connects to their current circumstances. And it's bizarre. Like, it is a very bizarre storyline. It's very wacky and weird, but it's really entertaining, and I think it has that classic John Allison humour at the centre of it, and like friendship dynamics, which are all very much part of Giant Days, and are two of the reasons I love Giant Days so much: the relationships between the characters, the friendships, and the humour. So the fact that it had both of those things, as well as like a bizarre fantasy side plot, I was like here for. I love bizarre, weird fantasy insertions in things. They don't need to entirely make sense, they just need to be like captivating and entertaining. So that is very much what this achieves, and the illustrations are also gorgeous. Like, I think it's really well illustrated and all round comes together really, really well. I think It is an underappreciated comic book series as far as I'm concerned, and it's also nice that it's quite a short, like quick to get through one. There's only 3 volumes and you've read the entire story arc. You don't need to commit to 20 volumes, you don't need to hang around for unreleased volumes. It's all there for you to read and enjoy. So yeah, if you like bizarre comic fantasy, like Tom Holt, then you'd probably really enjoy this. So next up is White is for Witching by Helen Oyemi, and if you want to talk about bizarre, surreal books, that's this one, and that is Helen Oyemi's writing in general, and I absolutely can appreciate that it's not going to be for everyone. This is like a Marmite writing style, I think, because it's very, very surreal, very obscure, very like mystical and not quite tangible. Like you can't quite get to grips with all like the answers and all of what's going on. I think in Helen Oyemi's books, I don't think you're meant to. Like they feel very ethereal, and this one in particular is my absolute favourite Helen Oyemi book. It is a horror novel which follows the story of a young woman who is just graduated high school and is off to university, to quite a prestigious university in the UK, and she meets another young woman there who she ends up having a romantic relationship with, so there's like sapphic rep in that regard. She's also struggling with a eating disorder, but very specifically one in which she craves eating things that aren't food, which I forget the name of, but is a real condition. But what makes this novel so different is the fact that it's narrated, or at least narrated in part, by a house, because the house is a very, very central part of this storyline. This house has been in this young woman's family for generations. Her mother lived there before her, her grandmother lived there before her, and there's something about her family and the women in her family, it's now just her, her brother and her dad since her mum passed away, is that they are supposedly witches, and their power is in part linked to this house. And the house, which you learn through its perspective, has a very possessive attitude towards these women. It wants to keep them, it wants them to remain in the house. But whilst there is clearly something supernatural or magical afoot with this house having its own sense of self and its own narrative, all of the events of the book could just be ordinary. Like they could just be happening. There doesn't necessarily need to be any magical force behind them, and in that way it makes you question to what extent what is happening in this story and what the experiences of these women who often have had to deal with severe mental health conditions is actually real or magical or both. And it's very strange and surreal, but beautiful and disturbing, and there's something so creepy about a house narrating a book, I've got to tell you, especially one as possessive as this house. So yeah, I really, really, really enjoyed this book. Continuing on the horror track, and I think it's probably no surprise that there's a few horror books on this list, because horror is a very divisive genre in that people have very specific expectations for horror, very specific things work for different people in horror, and it is very likely you're going to read horror that you don't love that much but other people do in your time reading the genre. So this specifically is one of my favourite horror novels, and that is Sealed by Naomi Booth. Now Naomi Booth's writing is otherworldly. Naomi Booth has to be one of the most beautiful writers I've ever read. I love her prose. I've read a few of her books now and I think it's so unique and bizarre and beautiful but disturbing at the same time, and she's able to communicate very deep, dark themes in a very beautiful way. So yeah, I love, love, love Naomi Booth's writing, and this book in particular is about a new disease that is spreading the planet. Now this is a book I read in 2019. Don't know if I'd responded differently now, but in 2019 I loved it. I thought it was really, really interesting, and that is the backdrop of the story. But we're specifically following a woman who is pregnant for the first time, and her and her boyfriend have decided to keep the baby, and she's having quite a tumultuous pregnancy. It's quite hard on her, and amidst her pregnancy she's become very much obsessed with this disease, which seems to be spreading. And at this point in the story it's not really being acknowledged as a huge danger to society by government, and she's very suspicious. She feels like from the articles she's reading online and from the information she's collecting, it is much worse than sort of hospitals and governments are suggesting. It's much more serious, but it's being kind of dismissed as this treatable phenomenon. And specifically what this disease is that you start to grow extra skin, specifically over like orifices. So the skin might cover your nose and your mouth, your ears, etc. It very much reminds me of an episode of Fringe, if you've ever watched that TV show. And because of that, it can obviously kill you. It can, like, you know, grow over everything you need to breathe through. And it is treatable, but in certain countries you obviously need money to treat diseases, so people are still dying of it if they don't have enough money to treat it. But like I said, it's being treated is not a big deal, not very serious, not spreading very rapidly, in only a few cases, and she's suspicious of that. But because of the way the book paints her as really struggling with her pregnancy, it's unclear at the beginning whether she's simply paranoid because of what she's going through in her personal life. Her mother has also recently died, or she is onto something. But whatever reason, her and her partner decide to move out to the countryside from the city, perhaps to help her with her mental health, perhaps to escape this disease. But obviously things don't just like magically work out when they get there. And this is a book that, although very much rooted in like a horrifying disease spreading the planet, is much more about a pregnant woman's relationship with her own body than anything else, and I think it's really, really well done, and I could not recommend it more highly. I think my upstairs neighbours are doing some furniture rearranging, so sorry if you can hear that in the background. But book number 9 is actually a non-fiction book, and that is a very short introduction to classical mythology by Helen Morales. So this is part of the Oxford's very short introduction series, which are small books, usually less than 150 pages, like small format, that tackle individual topics, like niche subjects. Some of them are more niche than others, some of them are more broad than others, but they take very specific approaches towards these subjects, and I think that is very much true of this book too, in that one of the like focuses of all these books isn't just like, here are all the facts about classical mythology or witchcraft. They are about our study and perception of those topics as much as they are about the facts. And I think that might be one of the reasons that this one doesn't get as highly rated. I think there's a very like strong likelihood that people pick up this book, this classical mythology book, expecting it to be like, you know, this is what Zeus did, and this is how the gods became this, and this is how the heroes did this, and this is like an overview of like the biggest Greek myths and the most important aspects of Greek mythology. But that's not what this book is. It's also about Greek and Roman mythology. It's classical mythology. This book is very much about like the study of classical mythology, our perceptions of classical mythology, the position of classical mythology in society from antiquity until now, as well as some of like those big facts and big myths. But it's not a rundown on the myths. It's like about what is classical mythology, and classical mythology is something we define as a modern audience, not the ancients. Like, Greeks weren't sitting there thinking, I'm going to go to my temple to worship my classical mythology. Like, classics is a modern conception. It is a discipline, and in that respect, that's what this book looks at. It looks at classical mythology as a discipline, and I actually think this is an excellent introduction to the study of classical mythology, and I actually think it will better root your understanding of myth if you then pick up a book of myths. So if you then go on to pick up a book that collects together a bunch of myths in one place by a modern author, or you go on to pick up an ancient work like Apollodorus' Bibliotheca, which collects a bunch of myths together, you will have, I think, a better understanding and sense of the study of classical mythology and the discipline and the topic and subject itself if you've read this book or read it alongside your reading of myths. So I think that's really important to bear in mind and to understand what this book is going for. And I do think there is something, and I do think that in general the Oxford Short Introduction series can be a little bit misleading with their titles. I don't think this one necessarily is, but because they have to be so like compact as books but then have quite broad titles, they can, you know, obviously not necessarily cover everything you want as a reader, but I think this book is a very excellent base. And Helen Morales is a scholar who I'm a massive fan of. Like, I really enjoy her scholarship. I first read her her work, her scholarship, when I got really into and studied the ancient Greek novel at university, and since then I've read a lot more of her books on different subjects, and this one included, which are all phenomenal. So yeah, I really recommend that book. Then lastly we have The Fallen Children by David Owen. So this is a YA retelling of The Midwich Cuckoos by John Wyndham. So The Midwich Cuckoos is a classic creepy sci-fi novel which I really enjoy. I really like John Wyndham's work in general, although I think it is in some respects very dated, but like the plots and the writing, phenomenal, love. And this book I think really does an excellent job updating that story, because what this book does is take the story of the Midwich Cuckoos, which specifically is about a small village called Midwich in England, where one day a bunch of women find themselves pregnant. So something happens to this village whereby everybody in the village falls asleep for a set amount of time, I forget, but like it goes into this weird stasis, and when they all wake up, the women of like childbearing years, even if they were fertile or infertile before, are pregnant. And then when they all come to give birth on the same day, having been impregnated on the same day by an unknown cause, their children all look exactly the same. They're a mix of boys and girls, but they're all exactly the same. Like they could be like twins, except there's way more than except there's way more than two of them. So they give birth to all these children, and it's very clear as the children grow up that there's something quite sinister about them. And because you know this book is a sci-fi, you kind of get from the beginning that there was probably some sort of extraterrestrial cause behind what happened. And what David Owen does in The Fallen Children is just incredible, because he takes that concept and he sets it on a council estate in London, because he takes that concept, but he sets it on a council estate in London where the same thing basically happens to a block of flats, and all of the teenage girls in this block of flats fall pregnant on the same day. But one of the things I think from the very offset that he does really well is tackle the violation of what happens to these women, because that's not something John Wyndham cared to explore, and that's what I mean by how some of his books are pretty outdated. You know, all of these women wake up pregnant and there's no exploration of how they might feel violated or how they have been physically violated, but that's something that David Owen does tackle in his book. And specifically the narrative is told through the perspective of one specific girl who is trying to figure out her own path when all of this happens. And oh my goodness, is it rare to find a children's book or a YA book where the kids are not middle or upper class. Like, that is rare, and I think it's really important and something we need better representation for in kids and young adult media, because, you know, the majority of kids are not from wealthy families. So it was really nice to see that, and it is so well done. It doesn't just simply retell an old story, it does something new and really important, I think, with an old story. So yeah, those are my top 10 underrated books. They are perfect for the right reader and the right demographic. So if they sound good to you, then please do check them out. Let me know if you have read them, what you thought of them, and which of them you might read in the future. Plus, if you think there are any books out there that are underrated, let me know, because I might like to read those. So until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye everyone!